Last year seemed to be the year of the GMT, at least with micro brands, as there always seemed to be a new one right on the horizon, which in retrospect actually seems a little bit ill-fated, as no one's doing a lot of traveling this year. But regardless of all that, GMTs still have their place in the zoom era, and they are still one of my favorites. Now, one of the watches I wanted to get a look at last year but never did was Zelos Horizons GMT, as it was a slick-looking watch that seemed to hit the sweet spot between design, size, and price. However, luckily this year is different, as they just released the version 2 of the Horizons GMT, and as I had already expressed an interest in seeing one, they were kind enough to give me one to review. So once again, a huge thank you to Zelos. But what's even cooler is that they sent me the Frost version with the fully lumed dial, which really isn't something you see very often, and was a whole lot of fun to film. But we'll get into more of that later. Right now, let's take a closer look. A lot of the GMTs I saw last year were unfortunately a bit on the large side, but that's not the case with the Horizons. In fact, I think a lot of people are going to think this case size is close to perfect. You're starting with a 40mm wide case without and 43mm with the crown. Yet the case also tapers as it heads upwards to 38.5mm for the bezel. And I think when you combine that with a rather narrow lug-to-lug of just under 45mm, you have a nice compact package. One that I think should be comfortable even for those with a slender wrist. However, total thickness is a little bit more of a complicated story. Now, one of the major differences between the two versions is that they're able to reduce the case height here, yet total thickness is actually a little bit more than the previous version. And that's all thanks to this beautiful boxed sapphire crystal, which sticks out 2.5mm above the bezel. So going from the exhibition case back to the center of the sapphire, it's almost 14mm, which is a bit taller than I like. Yet it's much closer to 13 near the edge of that crystal, and only 11mm to the top of the bezel. Since it staggers as it goes up, I think it wears thinner than it actually is, and I don't think you'd have much of an issue with longer sleeves and jackets, yet it's still pretty tall, and this is something I'm a bit torn on. Overall, I love how the Horizons look, but GMTs are primarily thought of as travel watches, and if any part of your travel plans have you going somewhere that has a real winter, when it comes to a watch, the thinner the better. Now, with this slimmer case, I really doubt this is going to be an issue. Yet functionally speaking, I think it would have been better if they'd went with a thinner crystal, just like the first iteration, even though I think this looks better. Now, even though it is a little tall, it never feels top heavy. In fact, I think it's one of the most comfortable divers I've ever worn, especially when you pair it with its bracelet, where it has a total weight of around 150 grams. It's just enough weight to give it a good solid feel, yet not so heavy it ever feels burdensome. It's just a really comfortable watch to wear all day, as it sits squarely on my 7-inch wrist. Now, comparing this to other Zeloses I've seen, I think it's closest to the Mako 3. They're both about the same size, but the Mako 3 has this massive presence in a smaller package, which really is something I love about it. Whereas I think the Horizons is a bit more balanced. It wears a little smaller, and I think it has a slightly more conservative presence. Well, at least until the lights go out. The overall case shape is rather sleek, with no crown guards and these short streamlined lugs. The finish is great, and has a circular brush finish on top and a horizontal brush finishing on the sides. There's also a beveled polished outline that runs the length of each side, and not just on the top and bottom, but it actually extends to the outward edge of those lugs, which just seems to highlight the overall outline of the case, and really accentuate the slightly curved tapering as the case narrows to the bezel. It's a really cool touch that I think lets the Horizon keep a rugged tool watch look, yet just adds enough visual flair to keep it always interesting. There's a slightly smaller crown at the 3, and I think it helps maintain the sleeker profile, yet it's not so small that you can't ever get a good grip on it. It is screwed down, as well as signed with the Zelos logo, in a mixture of brushed and polished finishes. On the rear, you have an exhibition case back, and once again we can bring up that form versus function argument. A number of people seem to think that a real diver can't have an exhibition case back, And while I don't completely subscribe to that train of thought, I think they are right from a functional standpoint. Yet, I don't think it should ever be one or the other. I think great watches seem to find a way to strike a good balance, which Zelos attempted to do here with his custom laser-etched rotor. And, as an added bonus, the caseback crystal is also sapphire. Now, a more decorated movement would look nicer here, but not if it would have raised the price too much. But let's move on to the bezel. And in keeping with the frost white dial, we do have a black and white colored sapphire insert, which is a little bit harder to turn with gloves, but without I never had any trouble getting a grip on the coin-edged bezel. And as GMT bezels go, this one is done right. It's a 48-click bi-directional bezel. It has a great action, minimal backplay, and just a good audible and tactile response. In true Zelos fashion, there are multiple colorways at launch, and as I said, this is the frost white version. And I have to say that when I first saw this online, I really thought it was going to be the odd man out. Unlike the others that have brighter colors and either a sunburst or a textured meteor dial, this one seems a bit tamer with its semi-gloss white dial and overall tuxedo-ish color scheme. Yet, I think this one is actually the second one to have sold out. The indices are a mixture of bars and triangles, with truly a beautiful mirror-polished finish. And I love how angled they are, as they always seem to catch the light perfectly. The indices are applied, and they sit in the middle of these black painted minute indicators, and they sit right before a very angled 24-hour chapter ring, which is in orange to match the GMT hand. And that chapter ring is something you don't notice very often. Given how angled it is and its position in relation to the box crystal, it often just blends in or gets distorted, which is something I like, as it's there when you need it, but then just disappears when you don't. The hands are flat, at least compared to the indices, but like the indices, they look beautiful in macro. The hour hand may be a bit of a short stubby sword, but it is perfectly proportioned for the dial. Yet the minute and second hand stretch out nicely to reach that chapter ring. Even though it's a white on white color scheme, the hands always appear distinct, making the watch easy to read. And that's thanks to the metal framing and the subtle healthy green glow coming from the ton of lume on the hands. The GMT hand is a traditional extended arrow, but here it has an orange tip, making it always easy to find. And as usual, you have the rather minimalist Zelos logo applied at the top, while down below you have a very small amount of text. And it's that text where my few complaints start to come into play with the design. The water resistance text is in red, and I think it stands out awkwardly. I think orange would have been better just to match the GMT hand. And as for the date at the 6, well, I do love its positioning as it does help maintain symmetry. And I do appreciate that on most of the colorways, the date wheel is matching the dial. Yet here, I think it looks a little off. It's just with its white on white color scheme, it kind of seems a little bland. But other than that, it's just beautifully done. The white backdrop just gives it a nice clean look and turns it into a true strap monster, all while being clear-cut, easy to read, and with a design that always seems to draw your eyes right to the center. Now with the bezel, the overall color scheme is a little bit black and white tuxedo, yet there's also a ton of lume here on the hands and the indices, but when you turn off the lights, then you're really treated to something special, as the blue lume on the bezel, the dial, and the GMT hand really start to come into their own. It is simply fantastic. Everything is clear and bright, yet because of that blue versus green hues, the hands are always easy to make out, and they don't blend into the background like I've seen with some other fully lumed dials. Now as far as the longevity goes, it's so good I tested it twice. In its initial test, I threw it up against a couple of its siblings, as well as a Phoebus and the Turtle. And there, it seemed to outlast everything but the Abyss. And with that, it seemed to go toe-to-toe with. So that right there tells me this is some fantastic lume. But, as you might expect, I didn't quite stop there, and I did take it up a notch by including the Phoebus's Great Wall. Now, in this 5-hour test, the camera sensitivity is up a bit, so it's not quite this bright in person. But you can see here that after the 3rd hour, only the Abyss, the Great Wall, and the Horizons are still visible. And by hour 4, the Abyss does start to fade out with the Horizons shortly after, leaving just the Great Wall barely hanging in there. So again, the Horizon has fantastic lume and some of the best I've ever seen. Now, as far as the movement goes, we have an Élaboré grade ETA 2893-2, which is a step up from your standard 2893-2, which means it really just has some better components, and that's supposed to lead to better out-of-the-box accuracy. It's high beat, hacking, and hand winding, and should have about a 38-hour power reserve. And like most GMTs in this price range, that GMT hand can be adjusted independently, which enables you to track a second time zone and even a third with the bezel. And as for accuracy, well, I found this one to gain about 7 seconds a day. While the Horizons comes on a bracelet, you also get a tropical rubber strap. And I think they're both pretty much what you expect. The strap is a simple black, and overall very lightweight and very comfortable. Whereas the bracelet is a little more interesting, but pretty much similar to all the other bracelets I've gotten from Zelos. It's done in an oyster style with solid end links and a good milled clasp with screwed in links. It starts at 20 and then does taper down to 18mm before hitting that clasp. And I think that gives the watch overall a great balance while wearing it. The bracelet's finish is pretty good, and it's overall brushed with these polished beveled edges that run the side of each link, which in many ways just mirrors the same style as the case, where that polished edges just seem to help highlight and outline the overall shape. Overall, it's just a good, comfortable bracelet. But with this white dial specifically, I think you have a whole lot of options to experiment with. Now, just like with other Zeloses, this does have an introductory price that will probably increase, although there's a pretty good chance they're going to sell out before then. As of filming this, there are already a few colorways that are gone, including this Frost one. Automatic GMTs are rarely cheap, and that's mostly due to the movement. And just to give you an idea, I tried finding out how much this movement would cost on its own, and I was finding prices that range from about $300 to $400. So I think $749 is a pretty good value for everything you're going to get here. And if you start looking around at other GMTs with the Élaboré grade movement, you'll see that this is about the price they start at, and they just kind of go up from here. However, if you're looking at just the standard grade 2893-2, there are some cheaper options, namely from Steinhardt and the Glycine Airman. And as much as I love my Airman, I have to say that this is on a different level, with just more detail put into every aspect of it. Now, it's not really an extensive list, but along those same lines, I think this is the best GMT I've reviewed so far. And while personally I'd like it if it was a little bit thinner, overall it's a great watch and a great example of what Zelos can do and why their fans are so loyal. It's an original design that's extremely comfortable and beautiful. One that strikes a great balance between function and flash. One that's easy to read, easy to use, yet always strikingly beautiful to look at. But let me know down below what you think about the Zelos Horizon GMT version 2, or if you can think of any other GMTs that are often ignored. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.